Very good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to the MMA Webinar Series 2020, as we continue to bring to you curated and rich insights in collaboration with industry experts, marketers, and partners. So today's session is powered by Zeotap, and the topic is Unpack Customer Intelligence, an absolutely important and relevant topic in today's times. As we understand it from the lens of MarTech and the role it plays today. The same would be followed by a very interesting fireside chat with Swiggy. The idea for the session is to demonstrate the power of first-party data and to better understand, which can help you better understand your customers. Thus, moving away from the past historical analysis approach to a predictive analysis model. So this session will have a lot of interesting nuggets and insights for you to learn better on how to engage your customers more effectively using first-party data. However, before we move into the session, I'd like to share with you a little bit about MMA. MMA is a unique body which encourages membership from across the ecosystem, be it the marketers, the agencies, the media sellers, and the tech enablers. Our membership is essentially 800 members strong, and the ecosystem is equally reflected in the India membership that you see on the slide. Pooja, can you move? So this is the entire ecosystem which we represent reflects across our markets. And our mission is to accelerate the transformation and innovation of marketing through mobile, enable adoption of mobile at scale to transform and to engage customers better. We serve essentially the chief pioneering marketing officer, and we enable the same through through four key pillars, which you see on your screen. They being the ones which help us enable building capability and know-how for the marketer, demonstrating impact from at a business level, and enabling advocacy like every other trade body by building standards and guidelines. And of course, building continuous inspirations and learnings through use cases and our awards. We also have several think tanks and groups which work closely with us on building intelligence, on building properties that is of value to the market. Smarties being one of the leading awards platform for us, which drives inspiration, creativity, and builds the best-in-class use cases for the industry. So what you see on the screen is essentially the think tanks we have, which work globally and also get localized, the industry groups which we have across key charters that we run, and the platforms we have in the form of events, be it Smarties, CEO, CMO Summit, and various other custom events. So today, as mobile is shaping the future, and we continue to use platforms like these to bring all the required intelligence and know-how for you. As we move on, we are also very sensitive to the current times and the situation we are all facing. Hence, MMA has built a central resource to help and support the marketing and tech industry. This resource is essentially available to the industry and is open to participation by all of you in terms of contributing and consuming the content. This is our way to support and be helpful and stay relevant in today's times. So you can visit the hub by logging onto the link mentioned here on your screen, and feel free to contribute to it and consume it, so that, as we believe, we are all in it together and we should be supporting each other as an industry. As I move forward, I'd like to share with you also a sneak preview of our upcoming webinars, which are scheduled for the fortnight of June. Amongst it is also our ongoing series, which is called There Is No Playbook for This, which happens every Friday. And as we believe that there genuinely isn't a playbook for this. And we as an industry need to come together and learn from each other as a group by referring to anecdotal information, by referring to new business practices that are emerging, and taking references from what's working and what's not in the industry. These sessions of ours are geared to help deliberate changes that have happened at a consumer and media level and its implications as we shape the future. So do log in to any of our webinars by registering on the link you see on the screen. So whilst I conclude a little more about MMA and hand it over to the speakers, I do want to share with you that these are all the programs that we are running, which are led by working groups who meet on an ongoing basis and execute industry initiatives that reflect either need gaps, growth, or an ask from members. That brings us to the webinar for today. Some of the house rules for us to know is we would be happy for you to ask us as many questions as you would like by logging on to the questions window provided in the bar below. Feel free to ask your question, but do ensure that you share your name, your title, and your company name so that the speakers would have context whilst addressing your question. We will try and cover as many questions as we can, and if we are unable to do so, we will try and have them sent to the speakers for them to address it, and we'll mail those across to you as well. So, so without much ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, which is Projjol Banerjea, who is a founder at Zeotap and a global member with MMA. Umesh Krishna, who would be doing a fireside chat with Projjol, and is the Director Brand Marketing and Head of Media at Swiggy. And myself, your host and moderator, Moneka Khurana. I'm the Country Head MMA India. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Projjol to walk us through this session on unpacking customer intelligence. So Projjol, all yours, and a very good morning to you. I know it's a very early start for you. So let me hand this over to you for you to take the viewers through the session.
Thank you very much, Moneka. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we have the privilege of Umesh Krishna from Swiggy joining us for this session. And maybe before we jump in, we can have a quick introduction to Umesh and his work at Swiggy.
Hey, hi. Thanks, Monica. Thanks, Projjol, for welcoming me into the session. Wonderful to join all of you here today. I am a director of brand marketing at Swiggy. I handle largely the functions which include the marketing insights, the brand management and the brand's architecture, and then the overall media piece spanning both digital as well as traditional channels. So I joined Swiggy about 3.5 years back. And then of course, Swiggy was, really set up strong, but very metro-centric. From those days, we have grown to over 600 cities in India. I've seen over 6 crore consumer acquisitions also over the past 4 years also at Swiggy. Very interesting journey. And I think the easiest way you can relate to my work is through all the advertising that you may see in your YouTube in stream or television. So most of the work that you see across comes from my team. And largely it's, the scope of work would cover everything from understanding the category dynamics, the competitive dynamics, bringing in those insights into our communication, into our marketing stack, building a marketing technology stack that will help us execute that strategy in a meaningful manner. That's where the entire work spans for me. Very interesting. Of course, been working with Zeotap also for the past few quarters. Very happy to join in and will be keen to hear out your questions.
Wonderful, Umesh. Thank you. And I spotted somewhere that you're also a certified fitness instructor. So if we have some time at the tail end of this, maybe we can squeeze in a few questions on how to stay fit during a lockdown.
Absolutely. Very happy to speak about that.
Wonderful. So jumping in, the agenda for today is for us to go through a few slides to help set the context for the discussion. And then I had the privilege of putting Umesh in the hot seat afterwards and asking some questions around his work at Swiggy, as well as his experiences with marketing, data, and technology. So, marketers' goals. If we dial back 109 years to when the Chartered Institute of Marketing was set up in the UK, they defined marketing as the management process responsible for identifying, anticipating, and satisfying customer requirements profitably. And it's probably safe to say that over the course of the last 100 years, if nothing else, these tenets hold true, and that marketers still desire to better understand customers. The challenge, of course, is manifold, and as the number of tools and platforms available to marketers grows, so does the complexity. And those range from sort of issues relating to the usage of CRM systems to making touch points across now an explosion of devices, connecting offline and online data, especially for brands and companies that have multi-channel footprints. And of course, most importantly, analyzing all the data and information available and drawing meaningful conclusions that can lead to effective action. Real customer understanding from our experience working with brands globally is a multi-step process, eventually resulting in shareholder value. Customer understanding drives customer behavior prediction, which is the first step to engaging meaningfully with the customer. Those in turn drive better customer experiences. And finally, happier customers lead to shareholder value. So what does that really mean for marketers? And often I think we tend to focus very much on new customer acquisition, which is for all practical purposes, the focus of many marketers and their roles. But as you know, as the saying goes, the best customers are the ones you already have. And we believe that the application of data in marketing is not only limited to the remit of new customer acquisition, it should also extend to optimizing the existing customer footprint, specifically looking at preventing churn or increasing the value per customer, cross-selling and upselling customers. Of course, that's fairly easy to say, but from a marketer's perspective, there persist many questions. Those questions pertain to the unification of first-party data. They extend to the likes of the enrichment of these first-party data assets with other data assets, calculating propensities, and of course, efficiently allocating marketing budget so as to be able to execute on all these strategies in the most cost-efficient manner. If we trace the history of data in marketing, the use of large-scale data in marketing was almost sparked by the introduction of programmatic at the turn of the millennium. And of course, the first stage of the process, or the first stage of this evolution, was contextual data. That quickly gave way to third-party data and the rise of the data management platforms that grew almost in lockstep with the growth of programmatic. As more and more decisioning became automated and machine-driven, these machines craved data, and that led to a profusion of data across the ecosystem. Unfortunately, what marketers realized over the years is that the quantity of data available did not necessarily always relate to quality. And ever since 3 or 4 years ago, there's been the rise of a platform category called the customer data platform, CDPs, that encourage marketers to look inward more than outward and focus on their internal first-party data assets. Again, these enjoyed their time in the sun over the last, or have enjoyed their time in the sun over the last 3 or 4 years. But as with many such tools and platforms, some of the gaps have also become more prominent. As important as first-party data is to the marketer's overall stack, it is often insufficient in the context of a larger, broader, multi-channel marketing strategy. which maybe brings us to our first poll of the day, which is, what does your MarTech stack look like? If you could quickly answer that poll, then we'll cover the results over the course of this discussion as well. While you guys are doing that, I'll move to the next slide, which is tracing the marketing journey across various layers of the process. And this is, of course, specific to the usage of data in the context of marketing. Data in marketing is a layered process, and it's particularly interesting in this case because the efficacy of each layer depends on the rigor and the success of the layer preceding it. So if we trace this right from the seed set, the first party data set is important because that sets the context and the stage. It is quite literally the seed for everything that comes after it. But of course, that first party data needs to be unified, and the identities need to be resolved effectively. Often first party data is insufficient. In fact, more often than not, first party data is insufficient. So it requires embellishment or enrichment with third party data. These combined first party, second party, and third party data assets pulled together can drive more effective modeling and predictions, leading to presumably better customer experiences. And that's directly tied to activation, including where and how you reach out to customers. And that in turn needs to be measured effectively. And the learnings from those measurements need to feed their way back into the first party data set so we can go through the process all over again. If we look at this in the context of the CDP stack, and here I have the results from the poll. So interestingly, almost half of folks here have a CRM employed, many have a DMP employed, not as many have a CDP employed today. And maybe that helps set the stage for this slide and this conversation as to how a CDP can potentially help you with your marketing efforts and where you might need to buttress those efforts with other tools. So in the context of customer data, any kind of user data that you generate across different touch points with your customers, and those could be anything from, say, email and points of sale as described here at the lower part of the slide, to website visits, as well as visitors or customers on your apps. Those data sets typically reside in silos across the organization. And the first step, of course, is to collect this data and make it available in a single data lake or data pool or a data store. But of course, those data sets also actually need to be unified in that you need a single customer view. So you need to be able to trace and identify the same customer across all these different channels and more where you have customer touch points. And that's, of course, the first party identity resolution. Where we see gaps there primarily pertain to brands not being able to effectively resolve these first party IDs because they often don't know that these users are the same or these identities are connected. So very often a brand will have visitors on their website, but will not be able to link those website visitors with folks that transact either at the point of sale in a retail store, or for example, somebody who sees an ad or someone they send an email to, because those identities are distinct, the identifiers are distinct. You have cookies on websites, you have possibly some kind of email tied to a transaction if you have a loyalty program, for example, and then you might have a device ID that identifies the customer in the in-app realm. But those identifiers are distinct, and therefore in the brand's data sets, internal data sets, those reside as unique siloed identities. So that's the first challenge. And then, of course, if you look at your user profile data, and this is something that we've seen with a lot of brands we work with across different verticals, they tend to have a fairly sparse representation of customers. They have a lot of potentially very detailed, granular transaction level information. For example, if you're a CPG or you're an e-commerce platform or provider, but you only have a sort of unidimensional view of the customer. You have the knowledge of the customer as it pertains to their transactions on your platform, and those transactions tend to be fairly single dimensional as well. And that's where we see the need for brands to enrich their first party customer asset with data coming in from other sources. Dependable socio-demographic data is the first step, but of course you'd like to extend that further to other behavioral data assets that can be used for you to build this more holistic customer representation. The next step of the process, of course, leading from this enriched data asset is what to do with it. And there we have brands that apply different kinds of propensity models, different kinds of predictive segmentation, but often the environments that they work in are ill-suited to these purposes. And that leads in suboptimal execution, whether it comes to emails or e-commerce, upselling, cross-selling, trying to increase basket value, or even if you look to call center interactions or engagements and how you can better improve those experiences to increase customer satisfaction, it tends to be suboptimal because the layers preceding it, as we discussed, haven't been fully fleshed out. So the first step, the first challenge really is identity resolution and extension. How can you take these disconnected, disparate IDs sitting across different systems and unify them to a single customer view? That would be a challenge enough in and of itself. But of course, we have looming above us the challenge of the third-party cookie going away over the course of the next 18 months. And depending on where you sit, you may already have begun to make accommodations in your platforms, since the likes of Safari and Firefox have long prevented the use or obfuscated the use of third-party cookies. But with Google's announcement and with their footprint at 65% of the overall web, this presents a major challenge to marketers. Of course, the other challenge comes in a regulatory form, where there's an increasingly stringent regulatory environment tied to the collection and usage of customer data. And many of the methods employed in the past don't necessarily have the requisite protocols and permissions in place so as to effectively collect customer data in a manner that is compliant with prevailing regulation. This is true, of course, of GDPR in Europe, upcoming regulations such as CCPA in the US, but also, for example, there's new regulation in Brazil. India has its own privacy laws. This is consistent across the board wherever you sit. So what does identity look like in a world without cookies? And maybe if I tag on to this question, the challenge of mobile device IDs also potentially going away in the future. The demise of mobile device IDs, of course, is not clear yet. There's been no major platform announcement, but everyone anticipates that Apple will be the first to move in this regard with doing away with the Apple IDFA, the identifier for advertising, which is essential to tracing customer journeys, in-app customer journeys, and everything to do with measurement, attribution, audience targeting, and any kind of modeling. So if you look at the future without cookies, without potentially mobile device IDs, how do you build a marketing strategy? And there are some efforts today to address this challenge. Of course, you have the likes of a Facebook and a Google, who have their own walled gardens. They have their own single customer IDs. They are incredibly efficient at identifying and tracing these customers, measuring this customer behavior. But the biggest challenge from a marketer perspective are the restrictions that are put on you. So the entire environment is closed. You have limited latitude to the extent to which you can use the data. And often some of the measurement standards and protocols are inconsistent with those outside of these walled gardens. So Facebook, for example, is notoriously intransparent with the way it measures advertising. At the other end of the spectrum, you've had some efforts with the IAB, with the Digitrust ID, and of course the Trade Desk's unified ID solution. These are better than the typical cascading daisy-chained cookie mechanism, because in these cases, there is a single cookie rather than a cookie sink, which makes them inherently more efficient. The biggest challenge there, of course, is quite conspicuous. They're all effectively based on a third-party cookie or some version of a third-party cookie that will be unavailable to marketers in 18 months. So that brings us to the category in the middle, which is the unified or universal ID that's based on first-party data. And I've cited two examples here, a company called LiveRamp based in the US, and of course, our own ID Plus at Zeotap, because we like to believe that the best way to predict the future is to create it. The idea of a universal ID that's predicated on first-party data ties back to being able to collect first-party customer data, typically email addresses or phone numbers, and build a network of these IDs across the ecosystem, but do it in a manner that protects customer data. So quite literally what that means is publishers are sort of the genesis of these universal IDs, and the idea is increasingly gaining steam. These first-party IDs, the email addresses and phone numbers, are tokenized by hashing and such to protect customer data, which basically means they are not easily interchangeable. But because they're all predicated on the same email address or phone number, they are fungible in that they can be traced across the ecosystem. Advertising and measurement can be transacted against these IDs, and then they can provide this information to different constituents across the advertising or marketing value chain. Of course, what's evident there is for these efforts to be successful, they need wide-scale adoption across the ecosystem, especially in the form of a currency. So the ID Plus needs to replace the concept of a third-party cookie or a mobile advertising ID, which brings us to our poll poll. And the question on your biggest challenges when it comes to data collection and identity resolution. And we leave that up for a while as we go to the next slide. As I mentioned earlier, identification is one major challenge that brands face in the wake of siloed customer data assets, in an explosion of siloed customer data assets across multiple channels, also in the wake of these third-party identifiers such as cookies and device IDs potentially disappearing over the course of the next 18 to 24 months. The other major challenges we've identified in our work is the lack of dependable, large-scale first-party data. So as I said, most of our clients have very valuable first-party data, but it tends to be sparse and it tends to be unidimensional, which basically means that these first-party assets need to be complemented, supplemented, enriched by...
So Projjol, you want to take a minute to share a point of view on the results we have on the screen?
Sure. Those are interesting results. So it seems that many of you identify with this challenge of data collection and identity resolution, specifically as it pertains to data setting in siloed or isolated assets, which is more than 50% of the audience. And then, of course, 30% claim they don't have enough first-party data, which is something that we also see across our work. And then the mechanics of collecting this first-party data is also, or the mechanics are inadequate. Great. We hope to address this in a couple of slides. Going back to the challenge of first-party data, and 30% of you have said it, your first-party data is insufficient, and it falls short when it comes to your larger marketing strategies. these first-party assets are often embellished with third-party data coming from various sources. And this is the example you see on the left here of the slide is a typical data marketplace that has a variety of providers effectively selling their data assets. And even if you assume that the data is consented to and meets all the regulatory requirements, and that in itself is a massive assumption because many don't. Even if you make that assumption, you still face the challenge, or you face a twofold challenge. One is the quality of the underlying asset, and the second is the challenge of these third-party assets, these external data sets, all being linked to different taxonomies. So just like you have an explosion of siloed data in your internal first-party assets, when you engage with third parties, external parties to embellish or enrich your first-party data, you have a very similar challenge in that third-party data also sits in silos across different providers, different taxonomies, and of varying quality. So the question there is, how many of you currently work with additional third-party data in bringing data from different external providers in-house and using it to enrich your own first-party data? And maybe we can run that.
Yes, so we've just launched it.
Sure. Can we see the results from the poll, Monica?
Yeah, I was just giving it another 5 seconds because I can see a lot of them, participating. I'm just going to shut it now, and here are the results.
Okay, wonderful. So more than half the folks here do work with additional third-party data. Excellent. So then maybe many of the challenges I identified resonate with you. And that brings us to the idea of customer intelligence. And there's a quote that's often been misattributed to Mark Twain, in that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The Chartered Institute of Marketing over the course of 100 years has had a consistent definition of the idea of marketing. And if you look at this definition of customer intelligence from 2000, it bears very deep resemblance to the overall idea of marketing, or the value that marketing can provide to brands, which is the analysis of information to build deeper and more effective customer relationships, thereby contributing to improved decision-making. In our experience, customer intelligence is achieved by addressing the various challenges I've discussed. And that starts with first-party data on the left here of the slide. And I know the slide is a little complicated, so I'll quickly walk through it. You have the challenge of first-party data residing in silos. These need to be unified. The identities need to be resolved. That's one major challenge. Then you have the issue of the first-party data sets being sparse or inadequate, and therefore they need to be enriched. These combined data assets need to be pooled into an environment where you as a brand can glean meaningful insights and results, leading to effective activation all the way on the right, whether that's on typical demand-side platforms or on social networks or on other channels that could be as varied as call centers or email marketing or even points of sale. And then, of course, the learnings from that activation go back into feeding yet another silo in the first-party data that needs to be unified. So when we look at identity resolution, effective identity resolution, we look at taking sparse, sort of disparate customer identities, customer identifiers, sitting in silos across a brand's internal data sets, and linking those with identities available in our extensive global third-party identity graph that's sourced from over 100 different providers. So effectively filling in the blanks with regards to the identifiers as well as filling in the blanks with regards to connections between these IDs. So you as a brand have a single unified customer view. And the second step, of course, that follows is the enrichment of the first party, the sparse, relatively sparse first party data with data sets, varied data sets from different providers that can help fill in the blanks. What we make available at Zeotap is a unified third-party data asset. So you contract with one provider and one unified taxonomy, rather than having to deal with individual silo data providers across different verticals with data from different taxonomies of varying qualities, and often with undependable, leading to undependable results. The last step of the process, of course, is taking all this pooled data and having an environment where you can run your analytical models. You can even give access to your data scientists so that they can glean meaningful insights, which can then result in more effective engagement with your customers. The only thing I'll add there is it's important as a brand for you to also consider that the environment needs to be safe, such that your first party data is treated with the utmost respect, and your environment sits effectively secluded from others using the platform. Often what we face with brands in more highly regulated sectors such as financial services is one of the reasons for employing a data clean room is not just for their own data to be siloed or secluded from others, but it's also that they would prefer minimal exposure to any kind of third-party data enrichment, and therefore a clean room helps them maintain sort of an arm's length with any kind of external data coming into their platform. And as we've discussed, the activation needs to be measured, and the learnings from that measurement need to feed back into the start of the process, because it helps complete the loop, it helps drive more meaningful engagement. So if I can leave you with 3 thoughts or recommendations. The first is to set up an identity strategy, of course, that's cookieless and that relies on permanent or semi-permanent IDs that are not linked to underlying cookies or underlying device IDs. And that's important in order to future-proof your marketing strategy and your marketing technology deployments over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. The second is to certainly to enrich your first party data with third party data or external data, or to focus on highly curated data, because it's very easy for data of sort of undependable provenance from external third parties to effectively sully your high quality first party assets. So it's important that any kind of enrichment activity you engage in when it comes to external data entering your platform is treated in a similar manner, in that it is equally high quality as your own first party assets. And then of course, utilize these assets effectively for better segmentation, modeling, and engagement. And that brings me to the next part of our session, where we will have a quick discussion with Umesh here about his experiences with some of these activities I've described in specific as it pertains to his work at Swiggy, but maybe drawing from his earlier experiences as well. Umesh, thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, hey, Projjol, hi. Good to be back. Yeah.
So maybe very quickly before we jump into the the more granular questions, you were talking about your evolution at Swiggy over the last few years and how you've seen the MarTech stack at Swiggy grow and its strategy become more sophisticated. Also, its business model evolve as a result of that sophistication as well, in some ways extending from the urban to the suburban and the rural areas as well. So can you talk a little bit about the evolution of marketing at Swiggy since you joined 3 years ago?
Sure. I think I'll just take a little bit of, skews the timeline a bit more and probably skews another 3-4 years, back. So it's an interesting story, right? So when, especially when digital came up big and digital first companies like especially e-commerce ones really came into the picture, we were really excited about what all digital could do, right? And the moment we jumped in, something that I and other marketers of my generation, something we realized is that the marketing stack hadn't really evolved. It was not up to the task in terms of the technology. The technology owners were still figuring out what is it that brands want, what do advertisers want, how to enable, let's say, a brand communication strategy or a customer communication strategy to be implemented through the stack. So initially there was this little bit of a disappointment, and then of course what people started operating a little bit in their silos, and then what happened is each individual layer grew quite well, right? So you're happy with your KPIs, your KRAs, and you can define them based on the part of the stack that you're operating in. Something in terms of talent also, at least in my previous firms as well as in the earlier days, it was not that we had the business intelligence or the business analytics skills which are married to the marketing stack, right? Versus the last 3 years, something that we've seen is in Swiggy, as well as I instruct for a couple of digital learning platforms and one affiliated course with the university as well. Something that we've realized is that now the learning is much more holistic, whether it's Swiggy or outside. People look at digital much more holistically, understand what each element of the stack does. There's a much more push for integration. So Swiggy, obviously, although we always have had our digital strategy, we have responded to the consumer and the market. Over the 3 years, there are times when we have chased scale, then we have chased efficiencies, then times when we have to go harder on personalization, right? Especially India being a very heterogeneous country in itself. So from a very top line perspective, that's largely been the evolution journey. Something that we have always tried to not lose focus on is, the communication. We still tell good stories, right? I mean, that's something that is specific to our advertising, and we can try to have that continuity across various channels. The ultimate goal has always been married to that one particular objective of serving what is extremely relevant to the consumer and avoid any kind of fatigue or irrelevance or irritation. So,
how does data work as the underlying platform to help drive this personalization of this relevance to consumers?
Sure. So you would know that, Swiggy has literally penetrated every single household in India. That means we sit on a huge stack of first-party data, right? In terms of largely the behavioral or navigational or purchase behavior sorts. But that is something that is very integral to our ways of working. And food delivery is a category that's literally relevant for you if you're awake at any part of the day, right? And therefore, the importance of personalization, timing of communication, all of it is very, very important to us. In all honesty, there is a lot of effort that's being done at each of the stack level for the communication to be as much relevant as possible. The personalization factor or the more integrated communication factor is something that we have worked harder in the last 18 months on. For example, if I were to deploy a brand marketing campaign, which would kind of give consumers the perspective of a particular category and how Swiggy can pitch in and help on that front. And later we pass on the audiences or the best responding audiences back to our remarketing teams, and then, drive harder, communications to ensure those conversions, right? We've also built in measurement as something very key. Apart from, the usual split tests or match market tests, which are conventional, we have also tried to see how the marketing stack itself can help us in terms of giving real-time measurements, more deterministic, accurate measurements, which are even more actionable. So in terms of building out the communication to the customer and then stepping back and measuring, understanding, this is how we have largely gone about in the last couple of years.
Maybe one last question from me, then we can take a few from the audience as well. In terms of the evolution of your marketing stack, how have the different pieces fallen into place over the years? What has been driven by the different teams? You mentioned your team engages with the remarketing team as well, because you drive the sort of the initial exposure to the brand, and then the audiences that engage deeper are the ones you then sort of pass on to the remarketing team and such. So how does the stack work maybe, and then how does the engagement between the different teams work in the context of this underlying stack?
Sure. So obviously, to just marry that to the flow that we have gone through the presentation, first piece for us always is to understand the first party audience better. Now, this would mean that one, we will have to bring in the right enrichment models or drive primary and secondary researches to understand the consumer base in a better manner, right? Marrying the numbers and the qualitative together. That is one thing that we work hard on and understand. And it's a very interesting category. To give you a bit of context on this, for example, if I were to go to most categories, your high value consumers will very often be highly skewed towards, let's say, a high disposable income, correct? Or it might be a mark of somebody's interest in that particular genre or particular category that you operate in. Versus Swiggy is, it's a product literally for anyone and everyone, right? And even the transactional value, it's not that I have to put $1,000 in every time I have to buy the product. So even across, let's say, a high frequency profile or high engagement profile, you could actually have so much heterogeneity in the audience. And to get that level of resolution, first party data, and then later working on very smart segmentation, either supported by strong marketing analytics or well thought out deployment in the campaigns become relevant. That's largely on the audience piece. Now, when we come to deployment, obviously it is about storytelling, right? Now, within storytelling, I think two pieces are very important. I could have a set of commercials, one that appeals a lot to a family member, the other one probably appealing more to a younger member in the family versus a senior. We could personalize and ensure that the delivery happens in a more indexed manner. Or going further ahead, also ensuring that, sometimes to communicate a theme, we may have to sequence an X number of stories. And sometimes we have to tell a mixed tale of stories. Now, how do I ensure that all these cut through to them? How do we layer it to them? And avoid, obviously, any kind of fatigue, something that we work hard on. That's largely the deployment on the marketing stack. Now, obviously, where a little bit of a skew may have come in is, since it's very video heavy, story heavy, a lot of integration has happened on very video first deployment stacks on the marketing campaigning front. But something that we have also done is thought through how other creative formats like AR could come in and do this job, and how can maybe AR interact with some of the traditional media deployments, or how can we kind of read some amount of cross-media interaction between TV and digital. That's also another layer that we've kind of worked hard on and trying to be a bit of omni-channel in our approach as well. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Projjol, I had a question for you. Now, this is sure. So this is something in terms of it's such a, and if you actually looked at the poll, something that I saw was there was this curve of evolution, right? People going from some set folks who are in the nascent stage, some trying to understand the improvement area and then grow multi-moment. Across these sets, how do you deal with, when you have to transfer the thought leadership, the strategy to your clients or the ones that you are pitching to? How do you deal with it in such a varied ecosystem?
That's a great question, Umesh, and like it is a bit of a variegated landscape in that different folks are at different stages of maturity or evolution process. I think what we aim to do is sort of go back to, you know this from your MBA days, go back to sort of first principles thinking, right? What is it that you're looking to achieve? The technology is less important in that the technology is effectively a conduit to getting from where you are today to where you want to be. And for us, it's a matter of achieving the brand's goals. And, depending on the nature of the client, that varies dramatically. So for, someone like a Swiggy, it is more specific to either a customer experience on the app or to actually driving transactions. To a client in the BFSI space, for example, it's better product development from being able to calculate risk better, for example, using very similar underlying assets in the form of data, but leading to very different eventual outcomes depending on the brand's goals. So I think that's where we start. And you're absolutely right. In some ways, over the last 5 or 7 years, there's been this profusion of technology across different brands. And if brands are honest, and if I'm honest with regards to my experiences with brands, there are very often stacks deployed within the brand that are being underutilized or not utilized at all. They're there because somebody took a decision 3 or 5 years ago that the client needed to have a DMP because everyone was doing it, right? So you sort of jumped on that bandwagon. And then fast forward 3 years, someone else takes a decision around a CDP. And they're all well-intentioned decisions, but they're not always often thought through in the context of how that contributes to the underlying brand goal. And that's where we like to sort of predicate our conversations.
Understood. That's great. Yeah, that's great to hear.
One question that's come up a few times, and you probably anticipated this, few folks have asked how your strategies have evolved or changed in the pre-COVID versus current versus potentially post-COVID scenario.
Sure. So some of the general category truths have changed drastically. So from a consumer first angle, the triggers, the barriers, the anxieties that the consumer has have changed drastically. It is linked to not just the economic scenario, but it's also, all the other bits, pieces that come alongside when you are in the middle of a pandemic. So something that we have tried to is keep track of the consumer behavior, whether it is on product, towards our social media communications, to our other customer or other customer channels, etc. Try to see how the attitude is changing and probably trying to be more confident in predicting how it would be a month, a quarter, a year down the line, right? Obviously, the category should see a great deal of recovery. It's something that people really love. They are seeking for the right validations and the communication from the brands as well, whether it's a language of assurance, whether it's promise, trust, etc. We're very keen. We are in a lot of listening and planning mode and slowly testing and deploying for the new era. Very interesting times as a marketer. Hopefully we'll be up to the challenge and should see us through this. Yeah.
So, Projjol, since there are multiple questions for both of you, I think if you'd like to pick a few for Zeotap and address those, and then maybe if there is time left, I will try and get some more answered. If we run out of time, we'll of course write back to them on these questions. So I think it'll be good to invest the next couple of minutes quickly going through some of the questions which you think you'd like to answer on behalf of Zeotap.
Sure. There's actually there are a few questions pertaining to the use, so the evolution and use of universal IDs. And maybe Umesh, let's start with you as to how you look at identities or identifiers across the different channels on which you engage, how you unify those, and then in the context of the demise of third-party cookies and the potential demise of device IDs as well. What is your perspective to identifiers in marketing? And maybe comment on the rise of universal IDs as well.
Sure. So two pieces here, right? From a pure play marketer standpoint, as you may be aware, Swiggy is largely mobile app ecosystem. So certain moving levers in the overall space may not affect us a lot. But obviously there's still significant volume and of thinking that we have to give to some of the other changes that has obviously happened in the environment. Something that we have to be very clear as marketers is never to be dependent on the suite of just 1 or 2 or 3 providers, right? if you become too dependent on the change of policies of one network or one suite, you're kind of like, marrying your strategy back to how a thought leader or a larger firm in the ecosystem thinks. So something that we all have always been actively thinking about is, how do we bring in the best of the integration to the stack, bringing in the best solutions and making them work together, and not to be over dependent or to be married to one of the elements of the stack. So from a marketing stack perspective, this is where we are looking forward to. From a consumer POV, I think a lot of our, like I said, there's great amount of transactional data and navigational or behavioral data, which we marry back to whatever are the other external signals that we can get. And we have been proactively looking at segmentation. And sometimes on the run, across campaigning or marrying various functions of business together, we kind of like use this segmentation and deploy them in our strategy.
Okay, wonderful. In the context of IDs, there's a question on the Jio Facebook partnership, and maybe I can quickly speak to that.
Yes, this is from Ravi Ganesh, just so that we call out their names as well. It's from Ravi Ganesh. Yes.
Sure. It's, of course, it's an important partnership in the context of, if the Indian market, you have the world's largest social network partnering with the largest telecoms provider. The early indications are that it will effectively be yet another walled garden in and of itself, in that it will probably be an extension of the Facebook walled garden, or an extension of the Jio garden, or in some ways, maybe a conjunction of the two. But it will be very important for marketers, and maybe Umesh, you can speak to this as well. It'll be an extremely important channel for marketers, just like today's walled gardens are. But it has all the challenges of the existing walled gardens, in that it is partly inaccessible, limited transparency, very limited agency with regards to what one can achieve on the platform and with the IDs.
I think, Prajwal, I think you covered a lot of very relevant pieces, and I think it somewhat marries to some of the pieces that we were discussing before as well. And from a retail perspective, so I've worked across hyperlocal in a couple of firms, across a couple of platforms. The communication to your neighborhood retailer or even a larger hyperlocal store, how do, let's say, a partner or an aggregator communicate, or how does any of the other pieces in the ecosystem, like the distributor or the consumer, etc. It's very nuanced, especially in India, where it's very, very fragmented. It's a very nuanced ecosystem. I think what has happened is something very unique, and the repercussions on the industry will be positive as well as quite revolutionary, is what I think, over the next few years.
So I think we have time for one last question before we close for today. This is a very deep subject, and I know we could talk about it quite a lot to really get clarity. But Projjol, this is the last question, and I think it'll be helpful. Unfortunately, the attendee is anonymous, but I will still call out the question. It's come a couple of times. After the cookies disappear, how do you think the process of data collection will evolve? Would you like to take that?
Sure. So to our understanding, the cookies are effectively an identifier that's in use today, because they are the prevailing currency. And as Umesh mentioned, it's important for brands to build strategies that are independent of platforms, independent of one specific provider or technology. And what we believe is that the universal IDs effectively will become a currency analogous to a cookie. But again, from a brand perspective, it is probably in your best interest to build a strategy that is independent of necessarily one universal ID, and to work with 3 to 5. So we believe that as the dust settles on this evolution over the course of the next, let's say, 18 months, in every market, there will be the emergence of 3 to 5 IDs. There will probably be 2 or 3 global identifiers, universal identifiers, and possibly between 2 and 3 more local or regional providers. And brands should probably look to work with all of them.
That's pretty insightful. And on that note, I do want to say a big thank you to Umesh and you for doing this session for us. And I'm sure it's provided a lot of rich insights to our audience, given that we had a marketer point of view and a platform point of view to walk us through the importance of customer intelligence. So as we bring this webinar to a close, here's a small snapshot of the various ways in which you can engage with MMA and be engaged with us by following our newsletters, by following us on our social media handles, and by participating in any of our various programs that we're running to enable the industry. So last but not the least, I do want to share a recap of the upcoming webinars for you. So do register for them. As you would have seen in the chat window, there is also a QR code out there, and you can kind of log in from there and register for them, or you can visit the link and register. These webinars are free. They are meant to enable the industry and evangelize and educate professionals in the industry. So we look forward to seeing you for the next one, which is tomorrow, 3 p.m. SGT. And thank you very much again, and have a lovely day ahead.
Thanks, Moneka. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Umesh.